welcome. Thank you for being here today. Looking back on 2 years to recollect our work was an exercise in reflecting how are we confronting the big problems of the world? Where did we help to build towards more impactful outcomes? And what are the challenges ahead? Today, I'll also share stories of our advocacy work, successes, and let me start with our purpose as an asset manager is to serve the missions of the family, foundation, congregation, and nonprofit clients through our approach to active investing. And it's thanks to our clients that we are able to be stewards of our long-term investments. So thank you for any clients here live or listening later. We are literally on a quest to collectively contain the planet from overheating. We are urging companies to take ambitious action to create more equitable workplaces, to listen to their employees. And we gather here today under a title that, in its very phrasing, demands a moment of reflection. Keeping to our convictions in the face of anti-wokeness. This phrase is potent, it's provocative, and it speaks to a broader, deeper struggle, one that we as stewards of wealth and well-being cannot afford to ignore. Our role as asset managers are at a pivotal crossroads. We are called to weigh risks, not just in the calculus of financial returns, but in the deeper sense of consequences of capital decisions, of investment decisions. We are charged also with looking at our impact, not merely in returns or quarterly gains, but in the broader context of how our decisions reverberate through communities, through ecosystems, and through the very fabric of our democracy. In a world where anti-wokeness seeks to stifle these considerations, we affirm our commitment to hold fast to our convictions. With that, let me move to who we are. For anyone new here, we, Zevin Asset Management, are a diverse, majority-owned and led asset manager. We've been in business since 1997, and we are 100% employee-owned by design. Ownership units of our company are given, not sold, to all tenured employees every 2 years, and not just to senior investment staff like it is the traditional way, but to everyone in our firm. We believe that selling units could have the effect of increasing the inequality divide that's present in many investment firms. And our thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion is not limited to ticking the gender, race, ethnicity box, but to welcome different perspectives that are shaped by cultures, by backgrounds, and lived experiences. We have a 9-person investment team that is majority people of color. We collectively speak 13 languages, and all or most of our investment team has lived abroad in 16 countries collectively for extended periods of time. So you could see that we are really practicing what we preach. We are a B certified B corporation. So certified B corporations are businesses that meet the highest standards of verified social and environmental performance, public transparency, business model, and legal accountability to balance profit and purpose. And we're so proud that we're in our 10th year. You could see on the screen that through 2022 of the reporting period, our scores have increased. And I invite you to look at our page where there's more details on what this means. So proxy voting, we wanted to share this with you because proxy voting is the ultimate litmus test. We have a duty to our clients and ourselves and future generations to use our voice. And this is one very easy way to align what we say with what we do. So we vote in favor of shareholder proposals that carry a signal for a low carbon transition, for more equitable workplace practices. And as you can see on this slide, we are very different from the larger institutional investors who are voting the majority of the time against proposals that are urging the boards to act on environmental and social issues. And we actually engaged the corporate governance team of Vanguard, their on the rationale for why their climate strategy says one thing and their proxy voting says another. And how do they justify voting against climate related actions if they believe in the promotion of long-term shareholder value? So it really felt like we were going back in time, and it was deeply concerning to see that such a huge investor with such huge proxy voting power could be out of alignment with its stated strategy. There were actually a large decrease in votes in our resolutions across the board, lower positive votes, because these large asset managers have retreated, bowed down to pensions that are being pressured by individual state attorneys general, for example, to not exclude fossil fuels or to not include environmental and social considerations in their investment decisions. So this is a concern for now and for the future. This is the slide where I want to spend the most time on, and where I invite you after this to jump in with your questions. So we know that public equities are a huge force in the global economy. The earnings of just Apple, for example, with a market cap of 3.3 trillion, exceeds the GDP of Canada, France, Brazil, and Italy's GDPs. We track our engagements from letters to companies, to Congress, boards of directors, our meetings, our partnerships, and our collaborations. And as you can see, some issues rise to the top in terms of the frequency of our engagements. And we want to choose priority issues that are based on their potential and existing social impact, the magnitude of the impact, and the relevance of these issues to us, to our clients. So these are topics that rose to the top: climate change, human rights, and lobbying and political spending. All of these three issues are interrelated, interdependent, and intersectional, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We want to measure our impact. It is not easy, especially in the public equities market. It is inexact, first of all, because change is not typically the consequence of just Zevin asset management pressuring a company to change, but the result of multiple pressure points, the results of collective action with other investors, with stakeholders, and with civil rights organizations and policy experts working together. So I wanted to share a story about Verizon and where we are on that, because we filed a racial equity audit proposal with Verizon, requesting that the company audit its existing policies, practices around racial inequities. And they started to track their data. We withdrew that proposal with the agreement that Verizon would conduct this audit of business practices and policies. And the result is a report that we reviewed closely and that we then followed up with Verizon to better understand, well, what's your plan for putting the recommendations from the racial equity audit into action? So the report is the output. We have what we need to understand where the gaps are. And it wasn't a perfect report, by the way, but that allowed us to engage the company and continue to have a dialogue on racial equity. And we are really glad that Verizon has taken steps. They, for example, have a very large frontline workforce, so they decided to drop GPA requirements and higher education requirements and focus on skilling their workforce or reskilling their workforce. They also expanded the hiring of returning citizens who have been justice involved, and they were doing this before on a on a siloed basis, and now they're really integrating and seeing the value of retaining of attracting and retaining new talent. So there is continuous feedback as we go forward in our dialogues. It doesn't end with filing a proposal, receiving a report, and then moving on. So I want to emphasize that the outcomes that we're looking for are much more than what we have so far agreed with Verizon, but we plan to continue to work with our companies to have better oversight, tracking, and disclosure of their workforce by broken down by race and gender and ethnicity. I want to share a couple of collaborative engagements that we've had. And one example is the Tech Equity Collaborative, who helped us to connect to the experience of the contracted workforce in the tech space and to learn about the pay disparities that exist in tech companies like Alphabet, Amazon, and Apple. They all have a large contingent workforce, and that means that they're not direct employees. They are hired by the company through a staffing agency or a temp agency, and they're known as non-permanent workers, freelancers, seasonal workers. And this is not widely disclosed. The size of this contingent workforce is rather large from what we learned, but not disclosed in terms of number. So we know from our engagement with the Tech Equity Collaborative that the pay and the benefits and safeguards like paid sick leave or family leave are even more limited in this segment of the workforce. I want to point out that the intersection of race and gender is what helps us focus on the most disproportionately affected populations, which is why we focus on human rights and especially on worker rights. The most overrepresented group are Black and Brown women. So we especially want to keep going on pressing this issue, not just with tech companies, but with companies that have contingent workforces. One harmful employment policy that we see in tech is the prevalence of non-compete agreements. So non-compete agreements or clauses appear in employment contracts, and basically the employee signs off on not seeking to bargain for higher wages with competitors or to start their own business. So this was meant for tech executives, but the non-competes trickled down to employment contracts for workers that have nothing to do with trade secrets. The prevalence of non-competes has been shown to suppress wages and to lock employees into their jobs, so suppressing job mobility. So we got involved with the National Employment Law Project and connected to their policy expertise to engage as investors on the business case for banning non-competes. The Federal Trade Commission last year effectively proposed to ban non-competes, and this year we were really glad to see that non-competes have been banned. But it's not over yet. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce that lobbies heavily through with corporate funds is opposing the rule, and we plan to continue to push for the enforcement of the banning of non-competes. And one more thing I want to share is the importance of public policy engagement in what we do. For example, the FTC work that we mentioned was on the policy side also because we wrote to Governor Hochul of New York State to urge the passing of the non-competes ban. That was when it was on a state by state basis, by the way. Uh, Another partnership is with the Responsible Business Justice Initiative, testifying on the Clean Slate Bill in Massachusetts. The Clean Slate Bill calls for an automatic record clearance that would of formerly incarcerated individuals that would unlock second chances for an additional 14 million employable individuals. 12 states have passed this Clean Slate Bill, so this is ongoing work that we're going to continue at the policy level.
Marcela, you mentioned the intersection between issue areas. Can you give an example of this?
Yes, and I touched on this a bit with the intersection of race and gender, and that really helps us to hone in on where the largest inequities lie. I mentioned the contracted workforce, but let me expand back to just, the frontline workforce, and to focus on an example of Kroger, a huge grocery retailer that is in the process of potentially merging with Albertsons, another huge grocer, which would probably end up with the loss of jobs, stifled wages, and so on. But when we look at the workforce at the front lines, like I said, the most overrepresented group is Black and Brown women. And we know that the double discrimination, the double disadvantage of gender pay inequities and racism prevent Black and Brown women from advancing the most. So we want to focus in on that. Kroger is an ongoing case of intersectionality because we think that as this merger proceeds and we're in touch with the unions that are also negotiating with Kroger, we're keeping a pulse on what outcomes we want to see and what board oversight we want to see over wage growth, the elimination of non-competes, and of many other issues that unions themselves are asking for and that we're channeling up the chain.
How is a small firm like Zevin able to create positive change given the size of its holdings?
I've been here 3 years and I've known Zevin my entire career, and I also wondered the same. And now in this seat, I find that our institutional knowledge, our deep network of experts, of stakeholders who inform us, who we learn from, and with whom we collaborate are what allows our voice to go further. And we partner with much larger organizations like members of ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, members from the Racial Justice Investing Coalition, who have a vast and deep network that allows us to tap into the issues and the solutions that the impacted front lines are calling for.
What process does Zevin use to choose issues to engage on?
I think we need to look again at the intersectionality of how different problems compound to that and result in disproportionate impacts to certain populations or disproportionate impacts in certain places. So I think climate change, we're seeing that now. I mean, it's here in terms of water scarcity, emergencies, disasters, migration. It's the people who are least able to cope with that change that are being most affected. Uh, I think the issues, it's no surprise that we continue to tilt towards worker rights and human rights and civil rights because we see that there is ongoing harm and also a huge upside from urging companies to have more resilient workforces in the future.
A similar question. Why does Zevin employ shareholder advocacy? How does shareholder advocacy enhance shareholder value?
We are long-term investors, and we do not stock pick our way to impact. I'm part of the investment committee, and with the investment committee, we select stocks based on the relative merits of fundamentals, but also environmental and social risks and governance risks. So that research process, the engagement with stakeholders allows us to build a better picture of a company. And that in itself reveals the gaps where companies are lagging behind on hiring or and retaining talent, or carbon transitions, or inequitable workplace practices, or lobbying, and pushing those companies to change.
What are Zevin's focus areas going into the 2025 proxy season?
This is definitely everything that we've covered here today, perhaps not specifically with Verizon, but racial equity. We have the corporate racial equity standards are going to be unveiled soon, and that was a massive undertaking of which Zevin was part of, PolicyLink, FSG, CapEQ, and many stakeholders to gather what does racial equity look like and inclusion and look like in a corporate setting, and not imagined by a corporation but by the workers themselves and stakeholders. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in what information do we want as investors to tell us more about what companies are doing, not just whether they hired or fired a DEI officer, but how authentically are they looking at human capital management and inclusion in their workforce. Uh, I think the contingent workforce is, it's a shadow workforce, and there's inequities there that need to be uncovered. So with many others, like ICCR, the Tech Equity Collaborative, and policy experts, we want to pursue more disclosure, but also narrowing those gaps and getting rid of that misclassification and inequitable policies that hinder the success of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the first place. I think issues like climate change and diversity are not going away, but we have new force multipliers like artificial intelligence. What what is that? What is that going to be like in the future? What we are putting a lens of AI on our companies now and seeing, well, who's designing, training, and deploying artificial intelligence, general artificial intelligence, to then be able to hone in on what are the impacts on workers, who's building data centers and buying, really making efforts to save water and cut emissions. So it's a really exciting and fast moving space. So those are three topics I think we'll be covering in 2025.
Thank you, Marcela. That's all the time we have today. Where can people learn more about Zevin's impact?
On LinkedIn, read our new report. We also publish impact updates. You can also write to us if you have ideas, collaborations, and thoughts. We are so encouraged by our partners. So thank you to our partners also for helping us do this work. I really appreciate you, and just stay in touch.